Alexander.
Yeah. So thanks, Matlup. Thanks very much for the invitation and for the introduction. For me, it's a really great pleasure to be here again at this virtual seminar. I remember the last time it was really during the pandemic, and the topics were pandemic driven. So today I'm presenting something different, and I also have to admit this is something which is a bit different from my core research, which is entrepreneurship research in general. But today I would like to look with you into this question, whether the gender of firm ownership matters when it is about the gender pay gap. So this is joint research with 3 guys and ladies, or ladies and one guy from Finland, Mika, Maliranta, Veera, Nippala, and Satu, Nurmi. The reason for this is relatively obvious. Finnish data allow to do research which German data, as so often, do not allow. This question could only be analyzed with Finnish data. Let me get straightforward into the motivation. I don't know why now, although before it worked, it does not work, but so here we are. There is, as you all probably know, there's a huge literature on the gender pay gap. And we all know that it has become smaller over the last decades, but it is still relevant. Also in Finland, because some people thought when I told this for the first time, Finland, why Finland? So we expect here no gender pay gap. This is wrong. Also in Finland, the gender pay gap is about 15%. So one strand of literature, and this huge literature, looks into the gender composition of firm management, and they say this could be relevant for the gender pay gap. Why? One could argue that the part of the gender pay gap that is rooted in discriminatory practices, this might be addressed by female superiors. So when we look, and I will come back to this a bit later with more detail, when we look into research, most, but not all research, and I will also look into these details, points to small effects when comparing firms dominated by female managers with firms dominated by male managers. So in firms dominated by female managers, there's a bit smaller gender pay gaps observed. Now, this is indeed now my personal motivation. Why did I want to look into it? Because we also have in Germany every day this discussion. And my feeling was, if there's one kind of group who might really address this question, it's those who own the firms and those who start running these firms. So female entrepreneurs, female business owners. Why they have different access to organizational power. On the one hand, on the other hand, they have more skin in the game through the capital investment, through the profit sharing. This might also be disadvantages in this pay gap discussion. But, and this is the most important thing, they may decide about wages paid to the employees in a different way. For instance, female entrepreneurs, when they start their firms, they decide about the wage from day one. So they could decide from day one, I pay to all the people the very same wage. They also have no interference with other people. So female managers entering a firm, they might found already a gender pay gap, which is already existing, might be more difficult to change this. And they might also be interfered by other managers, by other superiors, by CEOs, whoever. So it's a completely different game when we compare, so to say, female entrepreneurs, female business owners with female managers who are also hired by themselves in a firm. Now, coming to the theoretical background, why could the gender be really relevant for this question? There are two general approaches to this question. It's a more psychologically driven approach. They say that there are simply two kinds of discrimination, potential kinds of discrimination against a certain gender. The one thing is explicit discrimination when male superiors explicitly favor male or female employees. This is forbidden since a couple of years in Western economies. It still might be relevant, of course, because it might not always be easy to prove explicit discrimination. But what is more important about this is that there also might exist some kind of implicit discrimination when women confront unconscious, unintentional bias where male managers might be inclined to support or promote their male employees more strongly than female employees. So, bottom line, psychology argues simply there might be different forms of discrimination. We also know economics approaches to this. They are tracing back a long time. Becker was the first who said that there might be kind of taste-based preferences where employers face, so to say, disutility if they have to employ workers from opposite gender. And given 1957, most employers were males. He argues that female employees, to be able to be hired by male employers, would need to accept, so to say, relatively low wages to compensate for this taste-based preference. This was, so to say, the taste-based approach by Becker. The other approach, tracing back to Phelps, 1972, he argues that discrimination is a statistical fact rather than a personal taste. And he simply argues that the future productivity of women is less predictable than the future productivity of men, and that there's incomplete information about more or higher incomplete information about the future productivity of women because they are more likely to quit their jobs due to motherhood or because their partner is moving, they're also moving with their partner, and other further reasons. So what he says is women who cannot individually signal their future productivity must accept lower wages because of this statistical effect, statistical discrimination, in other words, and they might also, of course, face other disadvantages, like, for instance, less access to training. Now, recent research by Bertrand and Duflo, who are all very well-known researchers in this field, they argue that the psychological approach of explicit or implicit discrimination do also cover these theoretical approaches from the economics part. So what we do now want to do is we want to investigate whether women entrepreneurs are, so to say, reducing that part of the observable gender pay gap that might be related to any of these described discriminatory practices. Now, of course, the ability to reduce this gap is the one thing, but we also know, of course, this is not a sufficient condition for influencing the gender pay gap in firms. We also need to see, of course, willingness of female entrepreneurs to reduce the gender pay gap by introducing gender-neutral wages, or maybe by even creating new wage inequalities. And here again, we observe from a theoretical background, there are some researchers who argue that there are homophilous preferences. And this, if we could find among women, would lead to common interest between female superiors, in this case, female entrepreneurs, and the female workers. Others argue that this kind of principal-agent relationship between female entrepreneurs and employees may rather counteract homophilous preferences. Of course, there are also other reasons why there might differences in wages and also kind of discrimination, but we will not be able to focus on this. Namely, there might also be different negotiation behavior of male and female employees. But we need to keep this fact, of course, in mind, and there is independent research again on this question. Now, as of the same gender approach, what kind of reasoning is given here? So the one is female entrepreneurs may support, may help, may mentor female employees because of being of the same gender by, for instance, paying them higher wages, promoting them more often. Female entrepreneurs may also serve as role models, creating, so to say, positive spillover effects to female employees. And there's certainly one further interesting reasoning by Flabby, who says there are also gender-related communication styles. And this differ, so to say, between each other, where, for instance, females may be better able to assess the skills of their employees if they are of the same gender. Also arguing, so to say, why female employers might reduce the gender pay gap when they employ female employees. So this theoretical background argues that female entrepreneurs and female firm owners will act as what we call agents of change. They may seek to nullify that part of the gender pay gap that is auto-discriminatory practices, or they may even create new discrimination. Like I said before, there are also reasons against this expectation. There is reasoning that, in particular, when female entrepreneurs work in a male-dominated industry, that they need to become what we call one of the team. So, because I work with many male employees, only a small number of female employees, I need to give the male employees this good feeling that I'm one of them, and this leads me as a female employer to maintaining, so to say, these discriminatory practices and accept, so to say, the same kind of wage discrimination. There's a second reasoning that there's kind of culturally driven persistent gender status beliefs, according to which female, like male superiors, expect that male employees have kind of greater competence, that they are superior. And given that this is, so to say, culturally driven belief, it is also lived by female employers and female entrepreneurs. And then there's also, again, a third reasoning called the Queen Bee syndrome. This is has been defined by sociologists. They say that female superiors may feel competitive threats through other women, or may hold negative stereotypical views about other women's commitment. So two further reasons why female employers might keep, so to say, the same gender pay gap as male employers towards female employees, or may even make them increase the existing discriminatory practices. So if we put, so to say, these reasonings together, we would expect female entrepreneurs will not seek to nullify that part of the gender pay gap that is out to discriminatory practices. They stick to the same discriminatory practice, or like I said before, they may even increase these existing discriminatory practices. So it's not clear which of the two effects will dominate. But if we look more deeply into these reasonings, it becomes clear that those approaches of one of the team toxic machine approaches, they are mostly explained in settings where female entrepreneurs act in a male-driven environment. So that we come to the hypothesis that, first of all, we expect that overall the gender pay gap will be smaller in firms started, run, and owned by female entrepreneurs. Secondly, given the contrasting expectations that might be rooted into the gender structure in industries, we expect, so to say, differences according to the gender-related industry structure. In other words, in an industry structure which is male-dominated, we should expect much more discriminatory practices by female entrepreneurs than in an industry which is female-dominated. Let me also talk a bit about previous empirical evidence. Like I said before, the previous research did not look into entrepreneurs and firm owners, it only looked into managers, and there were two approaches. The first approach was that researchers investigated what happens if in a certain firm the gender of the manager is changed. So a male manager left the firm, a female manager came into the firm, and then they investigated, did this affect somehow the gender pay gap? And there are basically 4 research papers doing this. The first one, Cardoso, Winter, Ebner, they indeed found that Through this change of the gender in the management, the gender pay gap was reduced by 1.5%. Second research by Hensvik for Swedish data, they found more or less the same reduction, and she looked a little bit more differentiated into the data, and she found that this reduction in the gender pay gap was not realized through, so to say, changing the wage relationship in the existing staff, but through hiring more female employees and paying to them a bit higher wages. Then there are also two different observations, the one by Srivastava and Sherman. They looked in just one single huge ICT male-dominated firm. And what they found is, in general, this change of the gender in management did not reduce the gender pay gap. They even found, so to say, for female employees who were, so to say, on the lower part of their productivity, so relatively unproductive female employees, they were even more strongly discriminated by female managers than by male managers. So the gender pay gap in this specific area of the payment structure for female employees who were, so to say, on the very lower end of the productivity level, they were more strongly discriminated by females. Same thing was found by Flabby, but he also looked into Italian manufacturing firms, which are also, again, male-dominated industries. Then there's also a second kind of approach, which is a bit more relevant to us because for entrepreneurs, of course, who start their firms, we cannot observe a change. So this kind of research compared firms with a high share of female managers with firms with a high share of male managers. And again, Cohen-Hoffman and Hirsch for US and Germany found that there are slightly lower wage gaps when the share of female managers is relatively high in a firm. They find an interesting difference, by the way. Cohen-Hoffman for the US found that the management level at the highest level has a stronger impact on the reduction of the gender pay gap. In Germany, the management at the second level had a stronger influence on the reduction of the gender pay gap when these managers were female. So kind of also a hint towards different decisions about wage structures in the US versus the German environment. Similar was found by Abendroth, Zimmermann, and Sondergeld and Wohrlich 2017, 2022, and 2023. Of course, Klaus, I have to say it's a different Zimmermann. It's a sociologist.
I was getting already nervous. Okay.
That you didn't know that you had done research on this.
Well, sometimes you wake up and you have done something. Okay.
Yeah. So they found similar results like the previous ones. The most important difference was that they also included firm fixed effects, so that it was a bit more causal, able to make a causal relationship between the level of the firm management and the gender pay. So bottom line, small reductions also here found by research. So what we said now, what we want to investigate is what role does gender of the entrepreneur and business owners plays in the wages paid to female employees relative to male employees. And this was, like I said before, it has not been investigated so far. What we do take into account is the industry of the firms, given this previous experience, and of course, the firm size, because we also would like to know to what extent the owner is really able to look into gender pay gaps when we compare small versus large firms. What kind of data do we use? We use Finnish data 2006 to 2015 provided from Statistics Finland. question is, of course, why did we stop in 2015? Unfortunately, because some of these data collections were simply stopped in 2016, were not collected any further. Without going too much into detail what kind of sources these are, it's connecting, so to say, data from the structure of earning statistics of Finland, SES, also connecting with data from the employer-employee dataset, and from FLOWN, the Finnish longitudinal owner-employer-employee dataset, which are, so to say, the prerequisite to have information on the ownership of firms, on the gender of the ownership of firms, on the wages paid in these firms, differentiated by males and females in these firms. We have excluded several industries which are, let's say, not have so much special, how to say, outside of the typical market development that we did not want to include them. Why did we use all these data? In particular, also just mentioning that the gender of the owner was only possible to be identified through the Patent and Registration Office. So there are some differences also between the SES and fleet data, but I do not want to look more deeply into this. I think this is for our presentation not so relevant. But if you have questions, just interrupt me here. Now, coming to the descriptives, and these descriptives are already revealing one very interesting point. We see left line is, do you see my cursor? So it's the female-owned and mixed and male-owned firms. For us, for what I would like to point out here is when we compare female-owned firms with male-owned firms and look into the share of women. And what we see here is there are typical, let's say, traditional sectors like the manufacturing sector. We see males are dominated in both kinds of firms. Yeah, same with construction. But then when we go to the bottom, we see like the, let's say, more modern service sector industries, information, ICT, real estate, professional, scientific and technical activities, administrative and support services. We see an interesting pattern. In male-owned firms, the share of females is always below 50%. In female-owned firms, the share of females is always above 50%. So there is indeed a different hiring policy.
Alexander, do you know the location of the firms?
Sorry?
Do you know the location of the firms?
I have to ask my colleagues. I have to admit, I'm not sure. I think so.
I was just thinking it might be different in big cities versus small cities. The same industry might have a different kind of impact.
Yeah. An important point, good for future research.
Another question. What about the relative size of the female-owned firms versus the male-owned firms?
That's what you see in the second line.
Sorry. Yep.
Firm size, female-owned versus male-owned firms a bit larger than male-owned firms. And then we see on the right-hand side, unknown person owners, which are much larger. This is typical firms traded in the stock market where firm ownership is not known anymore. But indeed, overall, as you can see, these firms are rather smaller. There's something.
Units. What does 6 mean?
Sorry?
What are these units? Is it a log of size, or is it I don't know, 6 employees, 7 employees?
Yeah. This is the number of employees. Yeah,
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether this is not something like a log of sales or
No.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so having this in mind, by the way, and then there's one large, coming back to these shares, one last point I'd like to make is accommodation food services. Here in both, in all kinds of firms, there are more females than males. I come back later to this. So what would we do? We estimated OLS regression with this typical Mensa type log monthly and hourly wages. We started by investigating the overall wage gap and controlling, so to say, for the gender of the employee, the gender of the owner, and the interaction term. We included and excluded firm fixed effects and controls, the typical controls which you have here. And then in the second step, we moved on by separating firms by firm ownership, male, female, mixed ownership, which is defined as an ownership where the relation of male to female was between 40 and 60%, and unknown firm ownership. So we had four estimations, so to say. Let me start with results. What we find in Finland is without and with fixed effects, so without column 1, with fixed effects column 2, the wage gap is between 11 and 12%, or 11.6 and 12.4%. In firms owned by female owners, the wages paid overall is about, when we stick with the firm estimation with firm fixed effects, 1.4 percentage points lower. If we look into what kind of wages females get in female-owned firms, so it's the third line, we see they get a 2.3 percentage points higher wage, which clarifies that, so to say, the pay gap is reduced by 2.3 percentage points in the firm fixed effects estimation when female employees work with a female owner. And this is done, this is what we see, so to say, from a wage reduction. This is done basically not through higher wages paid to the female employees, but basically done through paying lower wages to the male employees. So that two things we get out of this. There is a relatively lower gender pay gap in female-owned firms, and this is realized through basically paying low wages to male employees in female-owned firms.
So, Alexander, I have a quick question on this one.
Sure.
When you look at the firm size, how is firm size defined? When it says,
this is now for all firms. I come back later to firm size.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I'll come to this in the second. But I can tell you right now, firm size is defined 0 to 10, 10 to 50 is medium size, and larger than 50 is large size, something like that.
So another question about these results. So with firm fixed effects, and you've got female versus female owner, so this is when the owner changes.
No, this is not when the owner change. This is when we observe that females work in we observe a female-owned firm. Because remember, we have female employers and female entrepreneurs who run their firms from day one, basically.
I guess I'm a little confused. If you've got firm fixed effects, wouldn't that take that out of the picture?
No. Why should it?
If that's always a female owner at the firm.
Ownership can change, I guess.
Well, that's what I was asking.
Yeah, but what he says is that these are not effects attributable to changes in ownership.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, you may have a change in ownership, but this is not what he measures. He
No,
measures whether at any point in time the owner is a female or not. But basically, I mean, the same argument. I was also thinking about that. This is correlation. This is not necessarily causation. So it might be, for instance, that women prefer to stay in female-run firms for other reasons, and because of this, they get rewarded for loyalty or something like this. I don't know. Do you have a tenure in that?
Leslie, would
job?
would it be resolved, the question, if he estimated this separately for female and male owned firms?
And that's why give me a second. I show you the result for the separate estimations.
Okay, but could I ask a question before you move on, though, on something else?
Sure.
Just so you're assuming that the females are distributed randomly across female and male owned firms, correct? You're not controlling for selection by the female workers.
No, that's certainly a problem. Yeah.
Okay, it's just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. We simply couldn't do this.
If I can pick up on one thing that you said. So you said that the gap is reduced in part because female-owned firms pay less to male employees. So, and that's I guess the minus 1.4% attributable to having a female owner. But then so now I'm thinking, does it apply to females or that's only for males actually? Okay, now
this is for all.
So it's for all. So basically, that means that in a female-owned firm, the
average is lower.
Yeah.
When we look then into the females, this is higher, and this means that the males are relatively lower compared to this.
But essentially, to get the pay gap, the gender pay gap, you have to add up all three numbers.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. So next up, we indeed now compared, so to say, we made these separate estimations with male-owned firm, female-owned firms, etc. And we see here, and we made, so to say, several further variations. We included compensation schemes, bonuses, vacation compensations, etc. And what we observe is, when we compare male with female-owned firms, that the difference is always more or less the same. In the hourly wages, it's always between 2 and 3% percentage points. And when we look into monthly wages, the bottom 3 lines, it's increasing towards 4 to 5%, irrespective of whether we control or do not control for overtime, shift work, etc. Interesting enough, when we look into unknown owners, I at least would have expected unknown owners take a bit more care of the gender pay gap, but unknown owners, if you look, for instance, here on the first line, with respect to hourly wages, are very close to what male-owned firms pay in male employees in relation to female employees. So, first of all, we find some kind of confirmed results, and depending on what kind of wages we look at, be it the basic model, so to say, or if we consider additional compensation schemes. What we wanted to understand in the next step is how is this gender pay gap over the distribution of wages. And we picked out 2 years here, for example. And what we observe here is there is a clear difference between the bottom part and the top part. In the bottom 50%, the gender pay gap is for male versus female-owned firms not significantly different. it starts at around, let's say, 6-7% for at 8% for female-owned and 9% for male-owned firms, and a bit lower in the second observation period and second observation year 2015. And then as we move up the distribution ladder, on the one hand, the gender pay gap increases, which has been found also in previous research, that indeed the higher up the distribution ladder, the larger the gender pay gap. But the difference between the male and female-owned firms becomes significant only in the top 50%, in the upper 50%. So to say, in the upper level of the gender pay distribution, the gender pay gap is in female-owned firms significantly lower than in male-owned firms. Now, for me, the most interesting result is when we look into industries, and I'm concentrating here now on male versus female-owned firms. And what we observe here is when we look in the, let's say, traditional industries, manufacturing, construction, there are no or only small differences between male and female-owned firms. So indeed here we observe what psychology is, so to say, expecting in male-dominated industries. Females do not behave very much differently. When we look into the bottom part, starting from ICT, real estate, professional activities, and administrative support activities, we see among male-owned business a bit lower gender pay gap. It's now between 8 and 10%. But this is the important point here, what we see in female-owned firms, there is no gender pay gap at all anymore, or it is very small, like for instance in the professional services. Significantly different from zero, so to say. So we observe here in these industries, the largest difference between female and male-owned firms. And these are the industries which I mentioned before, where in female-owned business, we also observe a higher share of female employees. And then there's the exception of these two rules. It's indeed accommodation, food services, where as in female, as in male-owned firms, the gender pay gap is relatively small. So basically two patterns with one exception with respect to accommodation, food services. We then also looked into the gender pay gap related to firm size, the one point you mentioned before. So small firms smaller than 10 employees, medium-sized firms 10 to 50, large firms larger than 50 employees. And here we indeed observe another important pattern. This difference in the gender pay gap between male and female-owned firms, it's only observable in the small and the medium-sized firms. Here we observe 4 percentage points different between the two genders, and we do not observe any difference anymore between female and male-owned firms in large firms. So we can argue that the gender pay gap reduction fades the influence, or if we can speak about influence, all of course, the association of the gender pay gap with female ownership fades, so to say, with larger firms.
So Alexander, I have a quick question for this particular results. Where does the collective bargaining or union membership come into play? Because I would suspect as the firms get larger, do you think that the unions might kick in? If so, where does that where do you pick that up? Is it somehow? See what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. That's one of the puzzles which exist in general. The people argue that in large firms there should be a much smaller pay gap because unions come in. What we generally believe, what is happening here is that unions negotiate about the basic wage, and then the differences come in through different other payments which are through the additional payments which are not covered through the basic payment which is agreed on. But this is, I would say, this is a general topic about all the gender pay gap analysis in large firms, because you observe it in all countries that in larger firms it is larger than in small firms. It's also a given fact, more or less. And you always ask yourself, how does that relate to the fact that exactly in large firms we observe a stronger influence of unions on the wage gap, but it must be explained through this additional.
Yeah, the only reason I'm saying is, at least in the US data, as the firm size increases, the union, non-union wage gap gets smaller, because non-union large firms don't want unions to get in. So they always jack up their wages, benefits, whatever you can. So in that way, the gap is much smaller in the larger firms. But when you look at, as the firm size decreases, unions can flex more in terms of getting higher wages, especially if there's a tight labor market. I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, but I don't know, because I don't know too much about Finland's labor market situation. That's why I was just curious.
I mean, let me say two things. The one thing, I know only of one paper comparing, so to say, gender pay gap in unionized versus non-unionized firms. There is a reduction in the gender pay gap in unionized firms, but it's not so large. It's also hinging around 1 to 2 percentage points lower. So it's not really a huge effect which units have. I would say that and this is also confirmed, so to say, by this analysis of the wage distribution. Wages are, of course, rather also determined by unions in the bottom 50% and not so much in the top 50%, and that might also explain these differences.
Okay, thank you.
And there could be some self-selection going on in terms of the women choosing, so if we connect it to psychology literature, maybe those who go into this big firms or particular industry are less likely to empathize with other, so there might be some of that going on, which is explaining. I mean, I know you won't be able to capture in here, but that's, as an explanation, that might be one thing.
Yeah, that's certainly one caveat which we could not control for. Okay, let me move on. One last interesting result is we looked also into productivity levels and wanted to know whether the gaps are different in firms with different productivity levels. We separated productivity levels in floor splits: low to medium, medium to high, and high productivity firms. And here, certainly also interesting to see that there is no difference in hourly wages. There is the same pay gap, overall productivity levels in hourly wages, and there is no increase, no significant difference. There's maybe a small increase in the overall gender pay gap when we compare low productivity levels to the others, but this difference is not significant. What is a bit more interesting here is that we rather see differences in the monthly wages. So we observe that the gender pay gap in male-owned firms increases significantly as the productivity level increases from 13% to 18%, and this is not observed among female firms. Here, the gender pay gap remains stable, so that we can argue that the overall gender pay gap in monthly wages increases with the productivity of the firms, which points to kind of different management styles with respect to, let's say, additional hours worked in the firm between male and female-owned businesses. Let me come to the conclusion. Given the time is running, I skipped. So we made one robustness check which confirmed these results, but I would like to skip that now. So What we observe is in Finland, the gender pay gap is 12 percentage points for hourly, 16 percentage points for monthly wages. We observe that the gender pay gap is 2 to 3 percentage points lower in female-owned firms than male-owned firms. And this difference is rather a bit larger when we look into monthly wages. We also observe that this pay gap reduction is realized through lower wage payments to male employees. We made several robustness checks with respect to additional compensation schemes, and these all confirm the observed differences. So first of all, we observe generally that the gender of the entrepreneur and of the business owners matters for the gender pay gap. When we look at firm size, we observe that it's reduced in particular in small and medium-sized firms, but influence fades in large firms. To me, like I said before, the most interesting result, also opening paths for future research, is that in the more traditional male-dominated industries, in particular, for instance, manufacturing, the average gender pay gap is larger here, and female entrepreneurs do not. In firms with female entrepreneurs, there is no difference with respect to this gender pay gap which we observe here. So one could argue female entrepreneurs here behave like what we call one of the team. They do not try to reduce this pay gap in any ways. In large parts of the service sector, by contrast to this, pay gaps are generally smaller overall, and female entrepreneurs, in firms run by female entrepreneurs, wages are realized, but pay gaps are nearly or even fully zero. The interesting thing, and this is where I would say it opens up avenues for future research, is that female entrepreneurs also employ more female employees in these firms. Lastly, gender pay gap varies a bit with the productivity levels, but only for monthly wages. And even very last but not least, we also observe that from the bottom to the medium of the wage distribution, gender pay gaps are largely the same for female-owned firms and male-owned firms. At the top of the wage distribution, the gender wage, in top of the wage distribution, the gender pay gap is 8 percentage points larger than in the bottom for male-owned firms, and only 4 percentage points larger in female-owned firms. So one could argue now, and of course I know this has to be expressed with very caution, that the part of the pay gap between female and male-owned workers that is out to discriminatory practices, that this part can be addressed by female entrepreneurs in small and medium-sized firms. One could also argue, if this topic would be high on the agenda, when female entrepreneurs run large firms, they would need to hire like-minded female managers in order to also address this gap in large firms. And it leads, last but not least, given that we observe that the gender pay gap in female-owned firms is basically probably related to the fact that they also hire more female employees than male employees, in contrast to male-owned firms. This observation, of course, could provoke, and this is not that I would support it or not support it, but it provokes certainly the case for arguing to increase hiring, to increase the share of female workers in firms by introducing a hiring quota. And with this provocative question, whether this observation is a good case for introducing hiring quota, I would look to stop the presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Alexander. Questions, Klaus?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander. Very instructive and clear. I have a simple question of understanding. I do understand this right. If you look at the raw data, the difference is 12%. Yes. Now, at best,
sorry, not the raw data. already controlling for
Oh,
typical.
okay.
So the raw data are rather 20% gender.
Okay, is that like in
We
Germany or
control
something?
for the typical controls which we have: education,
Okay.
number of children, sector, industry-specific working experience, etc. So we have control for the typical controls which are used in these estimation approaches for the gender pay gap, as much as we had information on this.
Yeah, because this is not so different than in Germany, where the raw numbers are also about 20 or something. But if you control, it goes down substantially. Now, my real question was then, when you get to female companies in small enterprises or whatever, at best the reduction is 2 to 3%, not percentage points. Yes, 2 to 3%.
Percentage.
Well, percentage points. A percentage point decrease means from 1% down is going from 10 to 9, whereas percentage decline is much smaller. Yes.
Yeah. It's so
what you find,
points.
This is percentage points.
Yes.
Okay, because that looks a little bit misleading, because a percent is, I mean, yeah, because it's very different whether it's percentage points or percent.
Percentage points.
That's okay, because okay, then it's larger, so it moves down from 12% or something like that to, let's say, 9 or something like that.
What you observe here? Take here the first line, all, and then male on 12.6, down by almost 3 percentage points to 9.7.
Okay, this means it's not percent, but it's percentage
like 25%,
points.
like 25%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, let me ask one. Part of the explanation might be that men and women don't communicate that well with each other, because there's a potential for misunderstanding. And so if you're a female owner, you may prefer to have employees with whom you can avoid this kind of misunderstanding. Same thing for male owners. And so, so effectively, some of the pay gap that you measure and some of the reduction in female-owned firms would be essentially because women are more productive when they work for women bosses, and men are more productive when they work for male bosses or owners. Would that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And this is exactly what, so to say, the paper by Flavi also has made as a main reasoning why this difference occurs. Exactly what you mentioned, the different communication styles, which brings you into the position that you are better able also to assess the other person.
Yeah.
So either we make rules about segregating the workforce in order to increase productivity, or we just make sure everybody gets plenty of communications training.
That would be one way of looking at it, indeed. Communications training, and maybe also hoping that the next generation is better able to communicate in between the two or many genders.
But I think that's, I mean, the second one is where a lot of places, I mean, especially in the UK at least, and elsewhere, I think the EDI and all these kind of trainings are given primarily to kind of be able to understand and communicate better, and among the genders and among different races and stuff like that. So it is, I think, they don't want segregation, but I think there's definite steps towards making the communication better, for sure.
Yeah. No, we shouldn't be for segregation. That's
No, that was just a
I know.
Yeah.
You were being provocative the same way Alexander was towards the end of his.
Do you have a tenure in the firm?
Yes, we control for tenure in the firm.
Well, could that be a dependent variable? Basically, if women find it more productive or more pleasant to work in a female-owned firm, they should stay there longer.
Yeah. That's a
And
good
so
point.
that would be another type of evidence that you know, that there's less job turnover for women in female-owned firms and vice versa.
That's a good point. Yeah.
What about
Okay.
line managers or bosses?
Sorry?
Because you know, in small firms, you have the average size of 6 to 7 employees, where basically it doesn't make that much of a difference. But in the larger firms, you have departments or units, and there it doesn't really matter that much who is the owner, what is the gender of the owner, but who is your line manager.
Exactly.
But I guess you don't have that information.
We had, so here indeed it becomes a bit difficult, but I mean, this was my reasoning why in large firms we don't see any difference between male and female owned firms, because in between there are exactly line managers who, again, according to their gender, may negotiate different wages. In these data, we could not, and because we were looking into this, we could not identify with 100% clarity who is a manager with, so to say, with the managerial power to negotiate wages. This is why we couldn't, so to say, look into what is the gender structure of managers in female versus male-owned firms. This would be indeed the next interesting step.
It's not necessarily whether the manager can negotiate wages. My wife works for a large company, but her line manager is a female. And the line manager proposes changes to my wife's changes to the boss further up the chain or to the HR. But you know, has so the boss has influence, not the ultimate decision-making power. But she kind of sets the agenda in terms of renegotiating wages. And that alone is enough.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Anything else?
Could you look at promotions?
No, unfortunately, no.
Yeah, that would.
And your data is panel, right?
Yeah, it's annual, and let's say there is one further caveat. It's not panel data. It's repeated cross-sectional data.
Right, but from the point of view of the firms, basically it's a panel for the firm.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's what someone mentioned at the beginning. You could actually observe what happens when the owner changes, if you have enough observations of that.
Yeah.
When the gender of the owner changes.
Yeah.
Whether
this is not, I mean, the question is, do we have, how many observations would we have here? That's what we could observe.
Exactly.
We skipped that so far. I mean, there's also a limit to a paper.
Yeah, because otherwise, essentially what you measure is correlation rather than causation, obviously.
Okay, I think it's a good time to stop. Thanks so much, Alexander, for a very interesting paper, very interesting presentation. And until next month, goodbye, everyone.
So,
thanks. Really interesting. Thanks.